Hello, I'm Professor David Holden. I'm a military historian and a veteran. All these ideas are my own and in no way represent the U.S. government or the U.S. Army. So today we're going to be talking about equity and equality and the difference between the two. Now, these terms are a subset of a broader structure. So we need to kind of set a foundation so that we kind of understand how these two terms fit into the modern topography of politics. All right, so you have your center. To the left of the center, you have your liberals. To the left of your liberals, you have the far left. Moving back to the center, you then have conservatives to the right, and then to the right of conservatives, you have the far right. That's your political spectrum. Now, the ideas we're going to be talking about are largely how the left perceives them versus how the rest of us understand them. The left's current trinity is diversity, inclusion, and equity. The acronym spells DIE, not my idea, but a bit humorous. So diversity isn't what you would expect it to be. It has more to do with sexual orientation, gender, and race. That's what they mean by diversity. Inclusion means that you have a certain percentage of those identity groups within your organization, and equity is not the same as equality, and we'll get to that in a moment. Equity has to do with equality of outcome. So the left has taken their trinity of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and has used these to launch an attack upon the Western civilization, especially the values of the Western civilization, which are in large part based on the Enlightenment, those Enlightenment values, and also the individual. And it does this because you're not treated as an individual anymore. You are part of a group, right? And those groups are based on your race, your sexual orientation, and your gender. Then it puts these various groups in competition with each other at a tribal level, and that's part of the reason why you see so much fighting going on today. It's no longer we're going to solve these problems together. Instead, it's one group's going to win and the other group's going to lose. Many of these ideas are a derivative of Karl Marx's ideas, where he talked about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat was like the working class, right? And the bourgeoisie were the business owners and the middle class, right? And so he saw one as being exploited by the other. And just like with Karl Marx, where you had the oppressor, which was the middle class of the business owner, and then you had the victim, or the one being oppressed, which was the worker. In the United States, we have the same thing. Now they say the oppressor is the white man, and the victim is all the minorities. It's just a subtle change here. We're just changing from class, and we're focusing on race instead. All right, so let's talk about equality and equity. Now, it's important that you define your terms when you're talking about politics with somebody, because using the same language but talking about totally two different things, or at least conceiving them or defining them differently. Most of us would assume that equity and equality are the same thing, right? We use them interchangeably. And I think that's kind of what the left is kind of hoping was going to happen, right? It's very much a sleight of hand that's going on here, because equity and equality are not the same thing to the left. Most of middle America sees equity and equality as the same thing, but they're not according to the left. We would define equity as being fair and impartial. Most of us, when we hear equality, we think equality of opportunity, right? That's the American way. Everybody gets a fair shot at it. But that's not what the left means at all. When they talk about equity, they mean equality of outcome, which is something very, very different. When we think of equality of opportunity, we assume that all individuals get the same chance to achieve success. With equality of opportunity, we all have a vested interest in this, even self-interest. When you go in for surgery, you want the very best doctor to be doing surgery on you. So it's in our best interest that we remove any impediments, any barriers to somebody that might be an excellent doctor, but if there's something in their way that they can't get there, then they're not going to be able to achieve becoming a physician. So we would want to eliminate those, because it's in our best interest that we have the best doctor operating on our body, because, well, we could die. So it's kind of important. But equality of opportunity, which is how America has functioned throughout most of its existence, is no longer in vogue. Now it's equity, or equality of outcome. Equality of outcome requires that all individuals have the same share of success. What does that mean? So let me give you a concrete example so we can bring these terms to life and make a little sense of them. So let's say that you want to become a physician. Now, to do that, you have to take the MCAT, the Medical College Examination Test. And let's say, in this hypothetical example, those who score in the top 30% get in. That's what we call equality of opportunity, right? That's how we all understand it. Those who do the best on the test get into medical school, right? That's the American way. Now, for the left, under equality of outcome, which is equity, right? As they define equity, equality of outcome, what that means is, again, those 100 people take the test. But rather than the top 30% who scored the best getting into medical school, that doesn't happen. Instead, everybody takes the test, but now we select based on gender, race, and sexual orientation. The most important thing for you, if you're on the left in this equality of outcome with that inclusion that we talked about, is that, well, you've got to make sure you have a certain percentage of blacks, Hispanics in this group, and also people of various sexual orientations, right? Those have to be included. That would be equality of outcome. Okay, so why is this a problem then? Well, under the first example, equality of opportunity, we're selecting based on who's going to be the most competent doctor, right? Either the people who score the highest are either the most intelligent or they studied the hardest. Either way, they're demonstrating the skills necessary to be a really good doctor. Race and gender never enter into it. And this matters to you because you want the most competent doctor. Under the second example, you're selecting for race, gender, and sexual orientation first and foremost before competence. That's a problem. And if that applies to broader society, that can make you less competitive in the global market. But Harvard already does equality of outcome. For example, if you're Asian, and this is one of the hidden things that the left kind of glosses over, the highest performing racial group is not whites, it's actually Asians. So if you're going to Harvard, you have to score 250 points higher than someone who's black or Hispanic to get in. For the left, anytime there's a discrepancy, right, between your various identity groups and you have more whites and you don't have enough minority group, they say, well, the reason that is because of racism. But often there's a very rational explanation for why these things exist. It's not racism. When you dig into the details, you go, oh, that's why it is. It's not because of racism. Let me give you an example. So in the U.S. Army, roughly speaking, about 70% of the officers are white, and roughly about 10% are black. Recently in the news, it came out that, hey, why is there so few flag officers, generals, or admirals that are black compared to those who are white? We don't have enough black or Hispanics in the upper ranks. Promotion to like colonel, the guy wears an eagle, or to general, the people have a star on their shoulder, come from combat arms. Combat arms are like your infantry, your artillery, your armor, guys who drive tanks, and maybe aviation, your fighters, right? That's often where your generals and admirals come from these combat arms. There are other branches in the Army. There's your logistics, your military intelligence, your signal officers, your cyber guys. All right, so there's other branches as well, but those aren't combat arms. Those are supporting branches. Well, more often than not, promotion to the upper ranks in the Army come from those that are in the combat arms. The people on the front lines in battle, right, are those that often get promoted up the ranks. And if you think about it, you often do this probably in your organization too. You often promote the people that have had hands-on frontline experience first, right? Versus people that have been working in the back all the time. Why? Because they have experience out there, so they can take this practical knowledge and combine it with theoretical knowledge, which makes them better at their job. And then when you factor in education in the military as well, based on rank, again, whites come out a little bit ahead of blacks in particular areas. 41% of officers in the combat arms are white versus 28% that are black. So you can see right there, there's a significant difference in the amount of black officers versus white officers. Then when you add in educational differences, that pretty much explains most of the reason for the discrepancy between blacks and whites at the general officer level. It has nothing to do with racism, right? There are very good explanations for the way it turned out. Now, if you doubt me, here's a more recent fact for you. You can Google, this was just in the news within the last month or two. The U.S. Navy wanted to make sure people weren't being racist, right? Because again, there's this assumption that so much of America is racist. This fact bears out that that's not the case at all. So what the U.S. Navy did was they took all the pictures for those, I think going for like flag officer or captain, out of the promotional packets. So when these packets go to the boards look at them, but there's no pictures anymore. So all they have to go on is the data. Well, when they look at the data and they started to do promotions, what they found was actually you ended up with less diversity and fewer blacks and Hispanics were getting promoted when you took the pictures out, because people were then just looking at competence, right? They're just looking at the data points at who would be the very best officer without taking into account race or gender. The U.S. Navy, assuming that there was probably some racism going on, took those pictures out. When they took those pictures out, they ended up with less minorities being promoted up the ranks. So now they're putting those back in the promotion packets. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the people on the promotion board weren't being racist. In fact, when you took the pictures out, you ended up with fewer black people, which means that when you have the pictures there, you end up with more minorities getting promoted. And when you dig into the details, you can see there's often very rational reasons things came out the way they did and had nothing to do with racism at all. The promotion in the US military came down to, are they in the combat arms? There's more white officers by a significant margin in the combat arms. Furthermore, there's this gender equality paradox. In other words, countries that have gone the furthest towards this gender equality movement, especially the Nordic countries like Norway, Finland, Sweden, you ended up with less women in the STEM, like science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You end up with less women in those fields because, shockingly, genders are not the same. Men and women differ, and they differ by interest as well. Women, generally speaking, are more interested in people. Men, more often than not, are interested in things like technology, right? There are differences between men and women. And when you eliminate all the other factors, the cultural and social factors, you end up with the biological factors coming to the surface. That goes to show you it's not always racism, right? People have a choice. Just like minorities may not choose to serve in the combat arms, women may not choose to go in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics as much as men. And there's nothing wrong with that. This push towards diversity, inclusion, equity is a bit confounding because the most important factors, believe it or not, is probably birth order and parenting. Did you know that only 7% of presidents are from the youngest child, while 54% come from the first and second born child? When you get done with this, Google it. CEOs by birth order. What you find is older ones, roughly 80+%, were firstborn. Today, it's still high at 44% of CEOs, of younger CEOs, so let's say under 40, right, are still the firstborn. Why is that? Because the firstborn gets more one-on-one with the parents. And that might have more to do with it than anything else about the success of a child. You can Google, there's so many different factors that demonstrate, again, birth order is profoundly important in how children perform in life. When you have your kids, right, they're born into the same family, they go to the same schools, they got the same relatives, they have the same benefits, they have all the same advantages, and yet you can't even get equity within your own family. As they grow up, some are much more successful than others. I mean, if you can't get equity within your family, how do you expect to get it in broader society? And some of these socialist governments have tried this, but the only way to enforce equity is you need a very large governmental bureaucratic system to enforce it. It often ends in tyranny because you have to have so much social power situated within a particular group that they can then force this down upon organizations and groups to make it work. And by make it work, I mean fail horribly. That's what the Soviet Union was, right? It was a system based and predicated upon equity across the board. And in the end, they end up killing between 20 and 60 million people. Not that I think that's going to happen here in America, but even the French in the French Revolution, right? They were going to have their virtuous society, right? And to do this, well, you know, some people have to die, right? You got to get rid of all the aristocrats, the aristocracy. If you see Pride and Prejudice, well, those are all the people that go to the guillotine in the French Revolution. The French killed like 20,000 people with a guillotine. Because if you know the formula for the perfect society, what wouldn't you sacrifice to achieve it? Nothing. Who's going to sit on this board of equity, diversity, inclusion, equity? Who's going to sit on this board? Like, what people are going to be there that are going to choose for me and you who should become a doctor and who shouldn't? Not based on competence, not based on intelligence, but first and foremost by race and gender? Does that even make sense? And how are you going to compete as a nation against China, right, when they don't do this? How do you think that plays out in the global market? Who do you want running the military of this country? Do you want someone who's selected based on their minority status or based on the best possible officer that's most competent? Who do you want leading your children in the battle? The most competent general or one based for their sexual orientation or their gender or their race? Because when you have this board of equity, who's going to enforce it? Who's going to sit on? What are your metrics going to be? You see how draconian and tyrannical this can become? Because in history, it often does. In the end, this is a recipe for failure. Hey, if you liked this video and you found it helpful, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment down below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you.